For 2,000 years, there's been this one central promise echoing through Christianity that Jesus Christ would return. But the question that has absolutely captivated believers for centuries is when? Today, we're going to break down the biblical timeline for the second coming, and we'll explore 7 key signs that are said to happen before this monumental event.
All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to kick things off with that foundational promise and the huge question it raises. Then we'll get into the first signs of the end times. After that, and this is a big one, we'll tackle a major split in how people think, all centered on something called the millennium. We'll break down the 3 different viewpoints there, and finally we'll see how those views totally change the interpretation of the final signs, and then we'll wrap it all up.
You know, everything we're talking about today really starts right here. 2,000 years ago, Jesus made a promise that he would come back, not as a savior this time, but as a judge for the entire earth. And that single promise, well, it sets up the whole framework for what we're about to explore. And that framework, it really all boils down to this one central question. It's kind of the ultimate mystery of biblical prophecy, right? The source material we're digging into today tries to answer it by laying out a very specific timeline based on prophetic signs. So, according to our source, the Bible basically gives us a prophetic roadmap. It lays out 7 distinct signs that are supposed to happen before the second coming. So, let's start placing these signs on our timeline and see how this all starts to take shape.
Let's jump into the first 3 signs. What's really interesting here is that, according to our source, a lot of Christians are pretty much on the same page about these. They generally agree that these events are, in fact, signs of the end times. The very first sign Jesus talked about was this: nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And we're not just talking about any old war. This was prophesied to be a global conflict, something humanity had literally never seen before. It's pretty wild to think that it was only about a century ago that the world even experienced its very first world war. And the specific language Jesus used here is absolutely key. He called these events the beginning of sorrows. Now, sorrows is a direct translation of a Hebrew idiom that actually means birth pains. So just like a woman's contractions signal that a birth is about to happen, Jesus was saying a worldwide war would be a huge sign that the end is near.
The second sign Jesus warned about was a huge spike in the persecution of his followers. Our source points to a number that's just staggering. Today, over 365 million Christians are facing high levels of persecution. To put that into perspective for you, that's 1 out of every 7 Christians on the entire planet. This really just hammers home how direct that prophecy was. It wasn't some vague warning. It was a very specific statement about the global hostility his followers would face before he came back. Okay, sign number 3 is the rise of false prophets who would deceive a lot of people. And in our modern world, this has taken on a whole new life, hasn't it? The source highlights how social media has made it easier than ever for someone to build a massive following and get people to hang on their every word instead of the original scriptures. Okay, hold on. Before we can even look at the rest of the signs, we have to press pause and understand a really critical concept. This is actually sign number 4, and it's where our nice, neat timeline splits into completely different paths depending on how you interpret it. So what's this big divide all about? It comes down to one word: the millennium. The Bible prophesies a 1,000-year period of just incredible peace and prosperity on earth. I mean, it's described as a time when predators and prey are going to live in harmony. But the huge debate among Christians is about when this happens and how. So here's the crucial point. Your belief about the millennium basically puts you into one of 3 distinct theological camps. Let's break down exactly what each one of these believes, because it changes everything. First up, we have amillennialism. This view says the millennium isn't a literal future 1,000-year period on a calendar. Instead, it's a spiritual allegory for the time we're in right now, the church age. So for them, that peace and prosperity is spiritual, something believers can experience today. Next is post-millennialism. People in this camp believe the millennium is a literal 1,000 years of peace, but, and this is a big but, they believe Christ returns after it happens. In this timeline, the church is actually responsible for spreading the gospel and slowly making the world better, bringing in this golden age. You can see why this view was super popular in optimistic times like the 19th century. Only after the world is perfected does Christ come back. And that brings us to the third camp, pre-millennialism. This view also sees a literal 1,000-year reign, but they believe Christ returns before it starts. This timeline is basically the complete opposite of the last one. The world doesn't get better and better. It actually gets worse and worse until Jesus has to return to intervene, defeat evil, and set up his kingdom on earth himself. This table really just boils it all down and makes it super clear. It all comes down to two questions, really. Is the millennium literal or is it figurative? And does Jesus come back before it or after it? Your answers to those two questions shape your entire end times timeline. All right, now that we've got those three viewpoints straight, let's look at the final signs and see how these different beliefs lead to wildly different interpretations of what's still to come. Okay, sign number 5 is all about the state of the world. A postmillennialist, who believes the church is making things better, would look around and see the world as gradually improving. They'd point to things like better social conditions or charities. But amillennialists and premillennialists would look at the exact same world and argue it's getting more evil, using the very signs we just talked about, like global war and persecution, as their proof. The 6th sign is all about the binding of Satan. Revelation says he'll be locked up for those 1,000 years, but how that happens totally depends on your viewpoint. An amillennialist would say his power was spiritually busted when Jesus died on the cross. A postmillennialist believes the church's influence will slowly bind him as the gospel spreads. And a premillennialist, they believe he won't be physically locked away until Christ himself comes back to do it. And the final sign revolves around a figure we all know as the Antichrist. For most amillennialists and postmillennialists, this isn't some literal person, but more of a symbolic spirit of deception that's always been around, always opposing Christ. But for most premillennialists, oh no, the Antichrist is a literal man who will one day rise to power, bring a false peace, and then be defeated when Christ returns. Now, just for the sake of transparency, it's worth pointing out that the creator of our source material holds the premillennial view. Their reasoning is that they believe in a very literal interpretation of the Bible, which naturally leads to the conclusion of a literal Antichrist and a literal 1,000-year reign that starts after Jesus comes back. So, the crucial question we're all left with is this: whether you see these signs as literal or symbolic, as happening now or way off in the future, the big question is still there. If these ancient prophecies really are a roadmap, what do they tell us about the direction the world is heading right now?